workflow for reproducible science.
All right, thanks. So my name is Trevor. I'm a PhD student at the University of Waterloo. And I want to talk to you today a little bit about scientific workflows. So when you go to produce a paper, how do you do that? It's something that we don't talk about a lot, especially among scientists, and it's something we should be talking about, so I'm going to talk about it. So really what I'm talking about today, I would kind of term more as recreatability rather than reproducibility, but I feel that if every scientist endeavors to make their own research recreatable and they share it open source, then eventually we'll kind of approximate reproducibility eventually. So just to situate what I'm going to talk about today, researchers do a lot of stuff, which Fernando talked about this morning. What I'm really focusing on here is this last step where you actually need to produce a research artifact. So, you feel like you've gotten something interesting, and so you want to publish a paper, or you want to give a presentation like the one I'm doing here. You're producing a research artifact, so how do you go about doing that? So if we think about kind of the ideal case, what would be the best way to do this? You'd want something that's recreatable, but that's also simple. If you're going to make an artifact, you're more than likely going to be under a deadline, and so you don't want to have to learn a new tool. And you want it to be fast, because if you are going to make some iterative changes, you want to see the effect of those changes right away, rather than having to kind of do a bunch of stuff and then see the changes later. So this is our ideal workflow, but typically these three things are not compatible with each other. The more recreatable you make something, the less simple it is. And the more simple and recreatable it is, the less fast it is. And so I think that I have kind of struck a good balance in my own workflow, and I want to share with you some tips to basically how I did that. So this is kind of a preview of, if you follow all my tips, what you might be able to get to with your own kind of analysis pipeline. So this is, I just submitted a paper to the Journal of Neuroscience, and this is essentially how I would produce that paper now. All I need to do is clone a repository from GitHub. I run this kind of convoluted, but it's all right. This Python script, run.py, with a bunch of command line arguments, and out pops this paper. This is a 22-page paper, and you can see that the figures are, relatively complicated. It's made up of multiple plots combined together in one single figure, which is put into a paper, all with one Python command. So how did I get there? So the first step, the first tip that I have is that when you make a new project, when you want to make a new research artifact, start a new directory for that artifact. People are going to be consuming your research based on these artifacts, and so if they want to know how you made that artifact, they don't want to have to look at a huge repository of all the things you've ever done. They just want to see what went into that particular artifact. And another benefit of this is that it makes it obvious, or it makes it pretty easy to version control this directory, because all that's in that directory is the stuff that's going to make this research artifact. The second tip, hopefully you're using Python, and assuming you're using Python, you should be using virtualenv. I don't have time to go into the details of virtualenv in this presentation, but definitely if you aren't already using virtualenv, use it. When you make a new virtual environment for each project, for each artifact, use the no site packages flags so that everything that's in your environment is all that you need to produce your artifact. And a little handy tip is if you cd into the project directory and use this set virtualenv project, run that command in your terminal, then when you start working on that virtualenv, it will automatically cd into that directory, which is kind of nice. When you're in that virtual environment, pip install anything that you need for your research, and then when you go to share this directory with someone, redirect the output of pip freeze to a requirements.txt file, and then it's pretty obvious all the Python stuff that went into your research artifact. Next tip, so you might be thinking to yourself, I'm making a lot of directories with a lot of the same type of code. Maybe there's going to be a lot of code duplication here, and you're right. But I would say that that's not necessarily a bad thing. In a way, it's kind of nice to see the progression of things as you produce new research outputs. But if you do find yourself copying huge amounts of code from one directory to another, then consider factoring that code out into its own package, or factoring it out such that you can contribute that code to another package so that it just becomes a line in your requirements.txt rather than a huge amount of code in your directory. Next tip, you should always have a README. This is, we all know it, but we don't always do it. Anything that you think you might forget, put in your README. So that means if you have to apt-get install something or brew install something, put that in your list of requirements. If you do have something like run.py, which I'll talk about in a little bit, then document all of the command line arguments in this README, and make sure that you're doing this README for yourself and not for the end user, because as long as you do it for yourself, it's pretty easy to adapt it to release later on. So just do it for yourself. Anything you might forget, put in README. Okay, so we have this directory. How do you want to structure this directory? So if you really think about the practice of science, essentially what's happening is, we do some stuff to create some data. That data, we plot that data, we combine those plots together into figures, and we put those figures into something like a paper or some kind of artifact. And your directory structure should reflect this fact. So this is the directory structure that I would recommend. A folder for data, folder for plots, for figures, for your paper, and then a folder that has all the scripts that produce these things. It also contains your requirements.txt and your README and a run.py, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So you might think that this is kind of a simplistic view of science. Fair enough. And in fact, really, there should be a cycle in here because science is really a cyclic process. But in any case, one of the important things that was wrong about that flowchart is that analysis is really a separate step that you should treat as a separate step. So really, you have multiple data files. Each one of these data files should be analyzed separately. And if you need to do something that incorporates data from multiple files, you should instead have some type of meta-analysis step that combines the analysis that you've done on these individual files. And then the results of those analyses are what get plotted, and then those plots are what go into figures, and then that goes in your artifact. So the key thing that you get from decoupling analysis, in addition to making things more obvious and factorable, is that you have this very obvious spot where you can parallelize what you're doing. You can analyze all these files separately as long as you look at analysis as a step that takes, as kind of like a compression step when you take a raw data file and compress it into the essential things that you want to tell people about that data. Okay, so next I kind of spoiled this run.py earlier, but run.py I kind of think of as a makefile for your paper. So anything that you want to do, anything that you find yourself typing into a terminal window, make it possible to do instead via run.py. And if you really force yourself to put everything in there, then it's going to be easier for you later on when you have to do revisions to your artifact, say. It'll be easier for you to say, well, all I need to do is Python run.py something. And if you find that, like, well, I can't do this thing using Python, then look into subprocesses, do something else, but make sure you can do it through run.py. So here's a little example of what a skeleton run.py might look like. So I have a scripts directory that has an analysis.py, plots.py, figures.py. I just have I'm going to loop over all of the files in my data directory, call an analysis function on that, take the results of that and do a meta-analysis on that, take the results of all my analysis steps and make a plot for each one of those. So plots.makeplot from that result, and then I'll make a metaplot of everything, basically what was in my meta results. I'm going to plot that, and then I'm going to combine those two things together into a figure. So pretty simple, pretty straightforward, but it gives you a lot of power because of the way that these things are now architected. One of the things you want to make sure you do is anything that you can do from run.py, you want to make accessible through a command line argument. A bad habit that I used to have is that when I wanted to do something new with my run.py, I would make a little variable at the top of that file. And depending on the value in that variable, I would change what I'm doing later on in my analysis workflow. And that would mean that if I wanted to change what I was doing, I'd have to open up my editor, which is a very draining process late at night. And so I ended up just not doing that. So a better way to do it would be to add a command line argument, even a simple one that just checks for the existence of some string in your command line, and use that so that you don't have to open up your editor if you need to do something different looking at your data. And a little bonus tip for this, if you are finding that you're adding a lot to your command line and it's becoming kind of unruly, rather than learn the argparse and optparse libraries, check out docopt. It's much nicer to work with. Okay. Next tip, which is kind of a doozy, is that as you're working through this, you should be able to generate your plots with one command and put that into a paper, but you're going to find that it's going to be slow, most likely. So profile your run.py to see what steps are taking the most time, and once you find out what they are, either parallelize them or cache them as necessary. So let's say, for example, this little for loop that does my analysis is pretty slow. This is kind of a great target to parallelize. So with just kind of 5 extra lines of code using IPython's parallel module, I can do all this analysis in parallel. So I make a simple load balance view, and then rather than just calling my analysis function, I'm going to call apply on my load balanced view so that it starts all these analysis jobs kind of going on in parallel in the background. And then over here, I'll just wait to get the results of those analyses when they're done. So already I've sped up my workflow by a few times if my analysis steps are all independent. Plotting is something that you might want to cache. You don't need to recreate a plot if you're just kind of tweaking your figure generation step. So rather than doing these plots every time, calling make plot every time, you can add in a little thing here to do this caching. So in this case, I know what the file name is going to be based on the file name of my data file. And so all I do is check to see if that plot file exists, and if it is there, I just don't do that plotting function. If it isn't there, then I call my make plot. So pretty simple. And one kind of extra tip, bonus tip for this is that it is still the case that some people don't want to release their raw data into the open. And if that is the case with maybe someone you're collaborating with or you yourself, it might be possible to release the cached results of your analyses openly, even if you can't actually release the raw data files. So that's kind of a bonus tip there. It might be a way to get around some confidentiality or curmudgeonry, if that's a word, of people. Okay, and then the last final tip is once you've done this, or actually ideally before you've finished all these steps, but at some point, put all this stuff online. If we want to, make science more reproducible, then we need to, make the first steps and put all of our workflows online for people to see. So an additional benefit to this is that you are not, I'm just assuming here, but you're probably not as good a system administrator as, say, the people at GitHub or Bitbucket are. So let them handle all this backup dealies. So as soon as you can, package up your code, put it on GitHub. That way people can fork it, they can look at it, they can suggest changes. So maybe there's a typo in your paper, use the power of the crowd to find your typos for you. When you're doing this, though, make sure you don't put all of your huge data files in these repositories because it's really not an appropriate place for them. Fortunately, there are places for your research artifacts and your raw data files. The one that I've been using lately is called Figshare. There's other alternatives like Dryad. But basically, they let you upload as much data as you want as long as it's kind of scientifically relevant. It gives it a document, a DOI, so that you can refer to it in a paper. And they let you store an unlimited amount of data for free as long as you make it publicly available. So it's a great option. So hopefully you found something in these tips that you can apply to your own workflows. If you want to see kind of a proof of concept that this works, you can check out this GitHub repository, which is the source for the paper that I just submitted to the Journal of Neuroscience, along with the data that is in Figshare. Yeah, so feel free to fork that. And if you want to see this talk, you can check it out on this website. My name's Trevor. Feel free to email me questions, or I'll take questions now. Thanks for listening. Yeah.
Okay, so a lot of times when you're doing analysis, it's going to depend on non-Python code, tools written in C or what have you, that are versions.
Yeah.
So besides just shoving it in the README, is there any better way to handle declaring the specific versions of your non-Python dependencies?
Yeah, so the question is kind of the question about kind of reproducibility, which is how do you handle dependencies and the versions of dependencies for things that aren't Python, because pip lets us have a requirements.txt file that has the actual version, but not everything has that. I don't have a great answer for you. I don't really know. But I would say let package managers do that. So in your requirements.txt, or sorry, in your README, just put the version that you used. I don't know if there's a better way to do that. A lot of what I give these tips here are trying to be kind of tool agnostic. This workflow should be able to work for whatever tools you're using. And so if you are calling out to a C library or something in R, you can still do it with these methods. But it's true that you'll have to use whatever those tools' methods are for tracking the correct versions and things like that. Wish I had a better answer, but that's what I got. Yep.
In your tip number 9, you have that idea of caching. Isn't that sort of treading on the toes of things like Make or Dexy? And how far down the track should your run.py try and reproduce that versus using those other tools?
Yeah, the question is about should you handle caching as a person writing a run.py, or should you let another tool like Make or Dexy do that? It's quite possible. I guess what I would say is that you never know which steps should be cached and which shouldn't, and so you want to make sure that you only cache the steps that are actually bogging your things down. Really, my perspective is that when you sit down to make a research artifact, whatever tools you're using to do the exploratory phase of that research are probably the tools that you want to use when you make your research artifact. And so, I've been in many cases where I need to make a paper, and I don't have really time to learn Dexy or to learn how makefiles work. I don't really know how makefiles work, but I made my own, so you should do that. So yeah.
What do you think about Fabric, which is a kind of a makefile for Python?
Yeah, the question is about Fabric, which is kind of a makefile for Python. I haven't actually gotten much experience with it. Am I correct in saying that it's kind of like a configuration? No, it's not like Puppet or Chef or something like that?
You can define functions in your file, and they are targets like in makefile. So
Okay.
you can define dev PDF, for example. I did it for my talk, and then
Okay.
it compiles the talk and everything.
Okay, so maybe Fabric is everything you need in my talk is moot. That's possible. Could happen. But again, this is another tool that I didn't have time to learn when I was actually creating the paper that I was creating. Sorry, caching images.
Yeah, when you change stuff that you should recreate the images, but you have caching there, so the file might exist. So
Yeah.
add that to your run.
Yeah, so the question is about what if something's in your cache that you really want to invalidate from that cache, and really I'm kind of hands off on that. It's definitely something that if you find is a problem, you should do that. You should, in your run.py, have some way to kind of override the cache, maybe having a no cache option or something like that. But typically what I've done in the past is that whatever plots that I wanted to regenerate, I just deleted and then ran my run.py again. And that was, for my workflow, was the easiest way to get around that. Okay. There may be.
So one of the bugbears that I worry about with reproducibility is always sort of bit rot, right? What happens, so this is on GitHub, you mentioned your apt-get, which you'll be running some Debian variant. What happens when your Debian variant goes off support and 3 or 4 years from now you want to try and reproduce this thing and a whole bunch of the stuff doesn't exist, or it's been deprecated because there's a giant security problem and you can't put it on the web anymore. Have you thought about that at all?
Yeah, the question is about bit rot. So, a lot of things happen such that software that you were using 3 years ago is no longer kind of available today. I haven't thought about that very much. Maybe because the way I see things is that I'm making artifacts kind of at a somewhat regular pace, and every time I go to make a new artifact, typically what I do is I copy what my old directory had in it and go from there. If something ends up not working, I'm going to have to fix that problem anyway, and so I fix it kind of as I go. Yeah, I don't think I have a very satisfying answer for that, but I'm not sure that anyone does. So.
So what would you say is the overhead of following these tips versus a lot of, as your colleagues don't do this? How much more time do you invest in trying to make sure that this setup is sort of up and running and sort of as opposed to just, generate once and forget the parameters.
Yeah, so the question is about how much overhead you pay in terms of human time. So how much time does it take to write a Python run.py? I would say that the time that you invest into this, all of this stuff, well, you got to do your analysis somehow, right? So it's true that so the thing that's the hardest for me is when I get the revisions back from my paper and I need to implement those changes and reproduce the figures in that paper. I find I have to relearn the terminal commands that I used to originally generate these things, and by compiling all of that into my run.py, it's no longer, I've kind of codified that and documented that by forcing myself to put it in run.py. And so there may be a little, it's kind of like, if you've seen that plot before of, the amount of time spent automating something, there's also an XKCD comic on this. The amount of time spent automating something is kind of, a constant, whereas the amount of time that you'll save kind of goes up as the time spent doing it manually goes up. So I would say that the overhead is kind of minimal, especially since you're typically doing the same things over and over again. The next time I write a paper, I'm just going to start with that run.py that I had before, refactor it a little bit, make it a little bit better. But because I made it myself, I know exactly what's happening. It's not that much cognitive burden for me to keep going from that point, is what I'd say. But I'm biased.